So it's my great pleasure to introduce to those who don't know him and to those who do, Bob Schultz. Dr. Schultz received his PharmD from Regis University in Denver, Colorado, and his master's in pharmacy here at UIC just this summer. His research interests include economic modeling and value evidence generation. Dr. Schultz is currently a senior manager of health economics and outcomes research at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. And today he's going to be talking with us about an analysis that he did with me, looking at the first-year costs of islet cell transplantation. So welcome, Bob.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Touchette, for the introduction. It's nice to see a lot of familiar names in the participants box here. I hope everyone's doing well during this pandemic, during these hard times. Things are crazy, but I miss all you guys, so I hope you're all doing well. The title of my presentation is First Year Costs of Islet Cell Transplantation. And there's one update that I missed on the presentation slide here is I do have a master's from UIC now that I received just in the mail just a few days ago. So without further ado, the first 10 minutes, I'm going to go over the background information, including the characteristics of brittle type 1 diabetes mellitus, the burden of the disease, and an introduction to islet cell transplantation. The following 30 minutes, I'll describe the methods and the results to this research. And then finally, I will discuss the key considerations, conclusion, and limitations, followed by 10 minutes for questions. But first, I'd like to recognize all of the folks who made all of this research happen. Dr. Touchette and Dr. Picard were my advisors on this master's research project, and Dr. Touchette has been my advisor since I was at UIC. And then the folks over at the UIC Islet Transplantation Research Team, Dr. Danielson and Dr. Monson, were very crucial in providing me with the information and data that I needed to be able to complete this research and answer any questions that we had about it. Alec Thompson is a pharmacy student here, and he helped a lot with drafting some of the manuscript and a lot of the groundwork for a lot of the stuff that we did, so I thank him. And then finally, from CellTrans, which is the organization that is researching and developing this transplant, Jennifer Cook and Dr. Oberholzer were really crucial in also providing me cost information and clinical information as well. But most importantly, I'd like to thank all of my fellow classmates during my time at UIC and all the faculty members as well, who have really been a huge part of my professional and personal life as well. So thank you guys. Brittle diabetes is characterized by rapid and unpredictable fluctuations in blood glucose levels. Patients with diabetes do not have a properly functioning feedback mechanism for regulating glucose because of a dysfunctional pancreas. The pancreas is supposed to react to changes in the glucose by releasing insulin or glucagon to stabilize their blood glucose. Brittle diabetes patients present with the most severe risk of diabetes-related complications because rapid swings reduce their hypoglycemic awareness, and hypoglycemia can be fatal. Type 1 diabetes patients are at the highest risk of brittle diabetes because of absolute insulin dependency and a compromised counter-regulatory response mechanism. The prevalence of brittle type 1 diabetes is estimated to be about 70,000 in the United States. A 22-year cohort study found very high rates of diabetes-related complications and high mortality rates in patients with brittle type 1 diabetes. In fact, about half of the patients lived beyond 40 years old, only half of them. 70% had significant kidney disease, 90% had retinopathy, and all of them had some form of neuropathy. However, this study did begin in 1980, which was before important developments in technology and treatments such as continuous glucose monitoring, insulin pumps, and intensive insulin therapy. A dated study from 1995 on continuous insulin infusion in children and adolescents found the mean hospitalization rate to be 5.2 per year, and the mean cost to be almost $30,000 per patient per year. There's really three treatment options for patients with brittle type 1 diabetes. The first is intensive insulin therapy, pancreas transplant, and then islet cell transplant. Since intensive insulin therapy leaves the patient at 100% exogenous insulin dependence, it's associated with the poorest outcomes compared to the others. However, we know that whole pancreas transplant is very costly, and some research has shown that islet cell transplant is very costly, but it's not as well described in the literature. A recent cost-effectiveness analysis and expected value of perfect information from Alberta compared intensive insulin therapy to islet transplantation and found the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio to be about $112,000 per QALY gained, which with an average life year gained of 3.3 years. The expected value of perfect information analysis showed the cost of islet cell transplantation to have the highest expected value of perfect information, which means that future research in this area is an important piece to the valuation of islet cell transplantation to make sure that it's the most accurate valuation. So what is human islet cell transplantation? In general, it's a method to stabilize hypoglycemic awareness in unstable blood glucose by restoring endogenous insulin secretion. It has been considered by some to be a cure. However, it may not last for an entire lifetime. So your definition of cure is up to you. It's completed by harvesting and isolating beta islet cells, which are insulin secreting cells, from a donated pancreas and infusing them into the portal vein. The islet cells sit in a capillary in the portal vein and react to changes in glucose and secrete insulin as needed. UI Health and University of California, San Francisco have really pioneered the clinical development of islet cell transplantation over the last couple decades. And the Chicago Diabetes Project and CellTrans, the organization that's bringing this treatment to market for patients, have provided the advocacy and the resources to allow these clinical developments to occur. UI Health has been conducting clinical trials since 2005. 30 patients have been enrolled in the trials. 60% of them remained insulin independent at the 5-year follow-up. And the range of insulin independence has ranged from 1 year to 10 years. The clinical and safety evidence has been generated over the past few decades. However, the economic consequences to private U.S. healthcare decision makers is underdeveloped. Many of you may be familiar with the AMCP dossier for formulary decisions, but for those of you who aren't, it's guidance. It's a guidance document from AMCP, the American Managed Care Pharmacy Association, that manufacturers follow to format their clinical and economic evidence that allows payers to make more informed coverage decisions. And AMCP in their document recommends the following. They recommend that manufacturers provide as much product pricing information as possible to the healthcare decision makers so they can plan and budget for future coverage and reimbursement decisions before it actually gets approved on the market. Product pricing information may help healthcare decision makers consider the potential economic impact and consequences of the product. Product pricing information may be provided in the form of price ranges or corridors rather than an absolute dollar figure. And this islet cell transplantation has been filed for approval for the FDA, and there's been some complete response letters that have been returned by the FDA, but it's on the, it's essentially expected to be approved within the next couple of years. We all know expected doesn't mean that it actually is, but it's important to have this information so that payers can actually consider covering this type of procedure, especially where it's a half surgical procedure. It is considered a biologic medication. However, there's a lot of variables that can change how much it actually costs to manufacture it. Therefore, the price of actually delivering this procedure is somewhat variable. So it's very important to understand exactly, excuse me, how much it may be costing the payers once it does get approved. Which leads us to the research question and the purpose of this research. The research question is, what is the economic consequences of islet transplantation in 1-year follow-up in non-uremic patients with brittle type 1 diabetes mellitus from the U.S. payer perspective? And really the purpose of this, as I was somewhat alluding to, is to uncover the costs that are associated with islet cell transplantation so that we can build and investigate the value that it may provide to the U.S. healthcare sector. In order to conduct this analysis, we collected transplant, follow-up visit, adverse event, insulin utilization, basiliximab and etanercept utilization and data from the UIC-hosted REDCap database, which is an electronic data source for the phase 1 through 3 clinical trials. There were over 3,000 variables in this merged data set, so there was a wealth of information that we were able to use. However, it did take a lot of time and a lot of resources to be able to organize this in a way that we could make sense out of it. We used the UIC protocol medication schedule for immunosuppressants and prophylaxis of opportunistic infections and thromboembolism with the assumption that patients remained adherent to these regimens. There were no reported adverse events of thromboembolism, transplant rejection, or opportunistic infection, which doesn't validate this assumption, but it may strengthen it. Costs for pancreas procurement, islet harvesting, and transplant infusion came from the FDA-approved cost recovery application and renewals. Just to describe that a little bit, before a medication or procedure is approved and on the market, in order to allow patients access to this type of medication without the hospitals or manufacturer taking a hit, the FDA will approve essentially a reimbursement to the hospital or manufacturer so that, one, it can be studied without too much risk, and also patients are able to actually access this medication for their benefit. Interventional radiology and hospital stay associated with the transplant procedure were from a recently published study from the UCSF transplant group. Follow-up visit labs and procedures were derived from discounted UI Health hospital charges. And finally, unit prices of pharmacotherapy were collected as wholesale acquisition costs from Redbook. And I hope Brian has a question about wholesale acquisition cost at the end of this. On to the population intervention comparator outcome time setting and perspective, or PCOT. The population for this analysis is non-uremic patients 18 to 65 years old with brittle type 1 diabetes. And the patients who were included were part of a prospective single-arm multi-center clinical trial here at UI Health. They had to have been under intensive diabetes management, which was defined as high insulin utilization and under the supervision of a diabetes specialist in order to be included into this study. They also had to experience at least one severe hypoglycemic episode in the previous 12 months that resulted in a hospitalization. And they had to have have reduced awareness of hypoglycemia as defined by a Clark score of 4 or more, or a hypo score in the 90th percentile. The intervention was islet cell transplantation and also the follow-up care that was associated with it, which included the procurement of pancreas, harvesting of islet cells, transplant infusion, and hospital-related care. There were 18 scheduled visits, and there were also ad hoc added follow-up visits that were included as well. And the pharmacotherapy included immunosuppression, insulin, opportunistic infection prophylaxis, thromboembolism prophylaxis, and anti-inflammatory therapy. There was no comparator. We are simply just looking at this intervention itself. And the outcome is the total cost of care. And the total cost of care is made up of 4 different buckets of transplant costs, follow-up cost, pharmacotherapy cost, and adverse event costs. And the transplant costs are broken down into the cost for procurement of the pancreas, the isolation of the islet cells from that pancreas, and then the hospital evaluation, pre-screening, and procedure itself. The follow-up costs were the routine visits, the added visits, and any labs monitoring or additional evaluation that was required for follow-up care. We already mentioned the pharmacotherapy costs, immunosuppressants, infection and thromboembolism prophylaxis, and monoclonal antibodies that were used for anti-rejection purposes. And then we also included costs for adverse events. And we categorize them into moderate hypoglycemic events, severe hypoglycemic events, and other adverse events. The moderate hypoglycemic events, they resulted in any kind of healthcare utilization, additional healthcare utilization, which could be from a glucagon injection or a trip to the primary care office, or some kind of evaluation that was related to hypoglycemia, where severe hypoglycemic events were categorized as anything that resulted in an ER visit, ambulance care, or inpatient visit as well. And then there were certainly other adverse events that were included. Anything that required healthcare utilization was included in other adverse events. And that all bundled up into the total cost that it would take in order to care for a patient who had an islet cell transplantation in the first year. The time for this intervention was 365 days post-transplant, which included the day of transplant and pre-screening as well. And then the setting and the perspective. The setting is a phase 1 through 3 controlled trial, UIC Department Surgery Research Center, and the perspective is the medical and pharmacy benefit insurer. And it may come up again later, but this setting is a controlled, very highly controlled trial where these patients are experiencing increased evaluation and increased monitoring. So one of the limitations is able to be generalizable to the real world situation when it's coming from such a controlled setting. Discounted hospital charges were used for the base case to more accurately reflect reimbursed costs. We understand that hospitals have charge prices, but that doesn't necessarily reflect what a payer is actually reimbursing. So we did have discounted reimbursements, so we used those instead of hospital charges for our base case analysis. In order to illustrate the potential heterogeneity of transplant-related costs and lab physician hospital-related costs, we conducted sensitivity analyses. We varied the bundled cost of procurement of pancreas, harvesting of the islet cells, and infusion procedure itself from $57,000 to $105,000, which is the range that is outlined in the FDA-approved cost recovery document that I had mentioned earlier. For lab physician hospital cost, we conducted 3 analyses using 100% hospital charge, which what I was just alluding to, the 100% hospital charge is an overestimation of what the payer's true cost is. So that was going to be an overestimate, we believed. And then we used the discounted hospital charge, which is what we believe to be the most realistic situation for a payer's cost. And that's why that was chosen as the base case input. And then the open access CMS, Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, lab and physician fee schedules, which was an underestimation of the actual payer costs, just considering that reimbursements from these fee schedules may be lower than what commercial payers typically pay. On to the results. It is common for patients to receive more than one transplant, even in the first year, and that's what we did see in the first year at UIC. Only 45% of patients only had one transplant, 55% of patients received two transplants. Including the operations and to manufacture and deliver the islet cells and hospital care related costs to each transplant ended up costing about $100,000 per patient per transplant. And when considering a little over half of the patients received two transplants, the average cost on transplants per patient was $150,607. The average cost on follow-up was $42,689 per patient. You can see the breakdown in the table by visits, and each visit had its own specific cost due to differences in ordered labs and evaluations. There were kind of milestone visits where they would do many more tests and evaluations at certain time points after the transplantation, which is why you'll see more tests or different costs based on the different visits. The values you see reflect both the cost of the visit and the number of visits that the patient actually had. And that's why we see that visits 1 through 7 are more costly, because when a patient had a second transplant, they restarted their visit schedule after the second transplant, so they would have two first visits. And also there's more frequent labs and testing immediately following the transplant. Also, these visits are bundled. For example, the first visit, there's actually 3 visits within that first visit, because the first visit is, the first sub visit of visit 1 is just for example, a trough level for sirolimus. There's no real evaluation. And then another visit that's similar. And then the third visit within that first week of visits is where you see the actual evaluation and a patient actually gets seen by a doctor instead of just going to the lab. So although it looks like there's 18 visits, these patients were actually going to the hospital or getting seen a little bit more often than that, especially in the first few weeks after transplantation. The frequent labs and evaluations that we see were complete blood counts, sirolimus and tacrolimus trough levels, and then also cytomegalovirus PCR to check for any kind of opportunistic infections as well. There were also Dopplers and x-rays just to see if there were any kind of damage or complications that may be arising within the surgery site or an infusion site. And patients averaged about 3 missed visits in 4 added visits. And sometimes the added visits were because they were making up for a missed visit, or sometimes there was just an additional monitoring that the physician wanted because they were worried about potential complications along with it. Onto the cost for pharmacotherapy. I'd like to reiterate that insulin usage came from the patient level data, and so did the basiliximab usage, while the immunosuppressants and the prophylaxis drugs came from the UIC scheduled protocol, and patients were assumed to be adherent to those protocols. Also, we did have info on the type and specific insulin used. Therefore, we used these specific prices when accounting for how much their insulin actually costed. And the cost for insulin per patient in the first year was $583. The immunosuppressants were around $17,000, and then prophylaxis for opportunistic infections and thromboembolism were right around $9,000, and basiliximab was $14,569 per patient, which summed up for an average cost on pharmacotherapy of $41,781 per patient. As earlier stated, hypoglycemic related events were broken into mild, moderate, and severe, and those were defined as shown. Mild hypoglycemic event, there was no intervention or healthcare utilization that was required. Therefore, there was no additional cost associated with them that we could measure anyways. Moderate events, there was glucagon or outpatient visit that was required, and then severe was a hospitalization or emergency department visit. There were 737 mild events, or 25 events per patient, which seems like a lot, but put in the context of continuous glucose monitoring for a clinical trial and rigorous focus and attention, it may not be as large as it may seem. A lot of these patients were reporting mild hypoglycemic events 4 or 5 times a day if they weren't kind of seeing themselves within the threshold that they thought that they should be, even though they weren't necessarily experiencing symptoms or their hypoglycemia wasn't that severe. 7 hypoglycemic events required glucagon, and 1 required an outpatient visit. All 7 of the glucagon moderate hypoglycemic events were from the same patient, so that patient may be an outlier. There was 1 severe hypoglycemic event that required a hospitalization. There were 51 non-hypoglycemic related adverse events. 23 were outpatient and 28 were inpatient. The most common reason for hospitalization was fatigue, vomiting, and dehydration, which will be addressed in the discussion. Adverse events were proactively reported and were included unless there were investigations and documentations to prove that it was not transplant or pharmacotherapy related. And that's an important understanding. As patients were going through this clinical trial, they did present with some peculiar adverse events that made the investigators believe that it was probably not related to this procedure itself. However, tacrolimus and sirolimus and some of the other medications have very unique and strange adverse events. And then once that was discovered, it was realized that we can't necessarily rule out some of these strange or seemingly unrelated adverse events. That brings us to the total average costs per patient. And to recap, the transplant costs were about $150,000 per patient. The follow-up costs were about $42,000 per patient, $43,000 per patient. Pharmacotherapy costs were about $42,000 per patient, very similar to the cost for follow-ups. And adverse event costs were $26,000 per patient, which all sums up into the $267,000 per patient with a confidence interval using the standard error from $245,035 to $288,993. And the amount of transplants that a patient could have, if you remember, 45% had 1 transplant and 55% had 2 transplants, that created a large range in the actual cost. And the minimum was $153,895 per patient, and the maximum was $365,537. So when we look at the actual transplant breakdown, we see that 58% of the costs come from the transplant procedure itself, and then 16% come from the routine follow-up and pharmacotherapy costs, and then finally 10% come from the adverse event costs. We did look at stratifications and also sensitivity analysis. When we looked at just the patients who had 1 transplant, we saw that the average cost was $218,301. And then when we looked at the patients who had 2 transplants, it was $306,593. Now let's look at the sensitivity analyses that we created just so we know we can decrease the risk that a payer may pay a lot more than expected, or maybe it's an overestimation, the payer may be lower. So it's always good to know a range instead of understanding just one cost for this. So when we look at the hospital charges with no discount, we see that it's $290,000, $328,000, and $365,000 when we look at the different costs for pancreatic procurement, which is on the y-axis. And then with the base case hospital charges, with the hospital charges minus the discount out of that, we see $230,000, $267,000, and $304,000 using the three different costs for procurement of the pancreas, whereas $267,000 was the base case average per patient cost. And then when we use the CMS fee schedules, which, as we earlier stated, is an underestimation of the total cost potentially, we see much lower costs ranging from $190,000, $227,000, and $265,000 for costs based on the three different costs for pancreatic procurement. So on to the discussion of key consideration, and as Dr. Crawford always taught us, so what, who cares? The transplant costs attributed the most to the total costs in this analysis, especially due to the 55% or over half of patients requiring 2 transplants. Improvements in harvesting technique and immunosuppression may lead to patients requiring lesser transplants or not having as much. We have seen greater success over the years in the clinical development of patients retaining fewer transplants and also having fewer complications. That is speculation. However, we have seen and do believe that there may be increased effectiveness on the clinical side of this that could eventually result into lower costs. Non-hypoglycemic adverse events, they made up 9% of the total costs, and several of the non-hypoglycemic hospitalizations were related to fatigue, vomiting, dehydration, and cardiovascular disease. These AEs are likely to be mixed meal testing, glucose tolerance testing, or complications due to uncontrolled blood glucose. For example, many patients during the mixed meal testing and the glucose tolerance testing, it is somewhat of a rigorous test, and a lot of patients did have issues or complications with this, and since they were already in a clinical trial environment at the hospital, they may be hospitalized simply just for those things, and that may not occur in the real world, especially with the likeliness that there's not going to be as many evaluations and monitoring once this gets translated into a real world setting. However, after investigating this with the actual physicians and primary investigators for this study, they did start to uncover that a lot of the vomiting and dehydration was actually because of the islet transplantation. And as far as cardiovascular disease, these patients have had uncontrolled blood glucose for pretty much their entire life. And we know that causes both micro and macrovascular diseases, and cardiovascular disease is a common complication in these patients. So it may not be necessarily related to the actual procedure itself, but just the underlying condition and how long that they've had this disease and how it's actually changed their pathophysiology of their vascular system. However, again, once speaking with the primary investigators, there are some of the pharmacotherapy medications that do have increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Therefore, it is not appropriate to rule out these types of adverse events. So they were included in the actual analysis. So what, who cares? This research used clinical trial data, estimated the 1-year cost of human islet transplantation, and will allow U.S. healthcare decision makers to make more informed formulary decisions by knowing the cost consequences associated with human islet transplantations. Cost offsets due to lower insulin utilization, decrease in short and long-term complications of brittle type 1 diabetes were not considered in this research, but will be used in future CEAs to investigate the value of human islet transplantation. And I think that Dr. Touchette and I think MJ, maybe Brian, are potentially working on this or are going to be working on this, hopefully. But essentially, this is just one piece of the puzzle, so we can know how much that it costs. So then we can see if there are cost offsets by some of the long-term benefits that patients may receive in this. So while the circle is unclosed, this is a very important piece of the puzzle, especially when we look back at that Alberta research of the expected value of perfect information, with this cost being the most needed piece of research for that. Recent research reports the 6-month average cost of whole pancreas transplant to be $408,800, which is $142,000 greater than our estimation of 1-year human islet transplant estimation. And also that estimation of $408,800 also didn't include some of the pharmacotherapy and follow-up visits that we included in ours. So when a healthcare decision maker is trying to make decisions whether they're going to restrict access to pancreatic transplant or restrict access to islet cell transplant and just allow patients to do intensive insulin therapy, these types of costs and these types of considerations are going to be important so they can create the necessary policies to be able to most effectively and optimize treatment for their patients and their budget. All research has limitations. And is this generalizable? Well, this is a phase 1 through 3 clinical trial that was used to demonstrate safety and efficacy, not necessarily to demonstrate costs, especially in this highly controlled setting. So the results may be limited in its generalizability to real-world practice. However, some may argue that the complex nature of brittle type 1 diabetes and the clinical rigor required to maintain a safe transplant may make generalizability less of an issue in this population. And what do I mean by that is immunosuppressants in thromboembolism prophylaxis and opportunistic infection prophylaxis, they typically have higher adherence because there's a much higher risk of safety issues if patients are not adherent. For example, compared to a statin or an immunosuppressant that may prevent rejection, patients are more likely to be adherent to their immunosuppressant medication. Inflated pharmacy costs. Wholesale acquisition costs may not reflect the discounts and rebates that are given to hospitals and also pharmacy benefit managers. So these pharmacotherapy costs may overestimate the costs associated with that. Another generalizability limitation. The UI Health charges and discounts may not be generalizable to other regions and health systems. We know that in the United States, different regions across the U.S. have different costs and different charges, and it just changes based on the location. Therefore, a hospital in the Northeast is going to be a lot more expensive than a hospital in, say, New Mexico. So therefore, this UI Health may not be generalizable to both, Dana-Farber Institute up in New England or a hospital that may be a rural hospital. Highly variable transplant costs. Although the sensitivity analysis does provide some context to the heterogeneity that is inherent in this, islet harvesting, pancreas procurement, and transplant, it may not fully capture the large variable costs associated with these types of procedures. In conclusion, human islet transplantation is estimated to cost U.S. payers $267,014 per patient over a given year, which is considerably less than whole pancreas transplant. Insurers should allow coverage and provide access to brittle type 1 diabetes patients upon FDA approval. This analysis will be a key piece of information when conducting cost-effectiveness analyses, budget impact models, and investigating the value of human islet transplantation. And with that, thank you, everyone, for your time and attention.
All right, thank you, Bob. Excellent presentation. And we're going to open it up to questions at this time. Also, you finished like to the second on time. It's like you practiced it or something.
I've done this before.
All right, what questions do we have for Bob? You can submit them via the chat box and I can ask him, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. Not hearing any questions right now. Please unmute yourself if you're asking.
Is Simon here? I feel like he's usually good for at least a couple questions. Oh, he is.
He is. He's not asking any questions, though.
I was waiting for Dan to ask questions.
Oh, okay. I'm too involved in the research to ask questions.
Does that mean it was perfectly done and there's no limitations that were unmentioned? What would be the ideally designed study, Bob? If right now you looked at costs, if you were to propose an economic evaluation and you had all the information that was requested, what ideally would you like to do in order to determine value for money for this procedure?
Yeah, I think the real value for this type of procedure is the long-term avoidance of complications associated with this condition. These patients just cannot manage their blood glucose appropriately, and that's not because they're not trying, it's just because their pathophysiology is just doesn't allow them to. So I think a study that looked at the long-term complications, whether that's hypoglycemic events over 5 to 10 years, or any type of complications that are associated with prolonged hyperglycemia, diabetic ketoacidosis, or those types of things. I think, and that's the benefit side of this procedure. I think the risk side of this procedure is also looking at this over 5 to 10 years and seeing how many transplants that these patients actually need over time, because we do see patients having to come back in and start losing their glucose control over, a few years. We did see that variability in insulin independence where one patient didn't have to use insulin for an entire year, and then another patient for 10 years. So there's just a lot of variability in the effectiveness of this as well. So really looking at how many transplants these patients are going to need over time, and then also the complications of somebody who didn't have one of these procedures done and just did intensive insulin therapy, and then a cohort of patients who did get this transplant done, and see what kind of difference there may be as far as healthcare utilization or long-term complications associated with it.
So how about in terms of a cost utility analysis, are the health utilities that kind of describe the health of these patients and the heterogeneity within this patient group available, or in a more ideal world, would you have those health states available for this specific type of patient group? Because you didn't really mention anything about the quality side and the health utility side of a potential economic evaluation.
Yeah, I think that's that's really interesting because that's one of the investigators was trying to ask Dan and I as well about quality of life, because these patients, they're having less hypoglycemic events. They don't have to have a caretaker as much because they're so unstable without this type of procedure. I think the biggest problem to investigate that is you can't just have a health state of patients who had a islet transplant and patients who didn't. You would have to have really unique health states and measure the quality of life in those health states of, let's say, a patient who maybe only has one hypoglycemic event over the year, or have some kind of way to define patients who are controlled and patients who are not controlled. So it would definitely take some brainstorming to figure it out, but there are definitely differences in quality of life in patients who get islet transplant and those who don't, and potentially even against patients who do get a whole pancreas transplant as well. So I think that's a really good point, and that's something that would be a great value of this, is showing that increase in improvement in quality of life. But I think it would just take some really kind of complex thoughtfulness to be able to define different health states for these patients.
Yeah, I mean, that's a project for the future where these different clinical practices that specialize in this could collect that data over time. And then you could, once you've got enough patient data, even within a patient, you'll know how to describe their health states and assign a utility to it if it's a utility measure, and then better populate models that can use costs such as you and Dan did in this study, so we get a better idea about value for money. But thanks for that response. I tried to make sure I came up with a question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.
You could potentially look at the probability of getting like kidney disease or cardiovascular disease and use those as health states as well, potentially. But
that's what I was going to say. There's two pieces to this. There's a short-term changes in quality of life, which might be related to having less hypo and hyperglycemic episodes. But then there's also potentially a decreased quality of life from having to take some of the immunosuppressants and complications from those. And then there's the long-term consequences, which is what we're going to be focusing on in the next study, because we don't really have a whole lot of information on the short-term ones. Quality of life analysis was not part of what was done for this NIH grant that covered these transplants.
Yeah, good points. Thanks.
Does anyone else have questions?
What's the next plan again? Do you guys have a step 2 to this?
Yeah, Bob will be less involved or may not be involved depending on his current situation with his job and everything else. But Brian Talon is going to be leading the next step, which is to develop a pharmacoeconomic model looking at the long-term projected consequences of having improved improved hemoglobin A1C in these patients, and predicting longer-term outcomes based on what we're seeing from this trial relative to where patients were prior to entering the transplant, or prior to getting the transplant.
Sounds great. Thanks. Nice job, Bob.
Bob,
thank you.
I do have one question for you. You touched on it, but I want you to talk a little bit more about it because it's really important for the future cost of this transplant procedure. And that was the number of follow-up visits. So here we had, it was probably a larger number of follow-up visits, but they're broken up into 18 specific visits. Some of the other transplant programs that have been running for longer, like Edmonton, they actually utilize a fewer number of visits now. Can you speak a little bit to that and what impact that might have on the overall cost of care?
Yeah, sure, especially since the follow-up visits did make up a good chunk of the costs as well. I think that just in the controlled setting that we had here and the more rigorous and close touch points that the patients had with the physicians and investigators during this may lead to an overestimation of the actual follow-up costs. I think that especially compared to the Edmonton or Alberta protocol that they had, which was fewer visits, which would obviously result in fewer costs associated with that. And we did do an analysis for the manuscript that looked at this as well. I think the problem and the risk is that we don't know how the efficacy could change or how things could potentially change if patients do have fewer follow-up visits. And I think that there's just a little bit too much risk to, I guess, endorse fewer follow-up visits. So it's kind of, I guess, off limits for anything in the public domain. But as far as just conceptualizing how this could translate into the real world, I would expect that there would be fewer actual follow-up visits. I would expect adherence and whatnot to be somewhat similar. But as far as the follow-up visits, I would expect there to be fewer. And I think in our analysis, we did do like a 50% decrease in the amount of follow-up visits because there were a lot of close touch points in this actual clinical trial setting. And I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. It's a question that both Simon and I had when we reviewed the manuscript, and that's what are the differences between pharmacoeconomic analyses alongside clinical trials and pharmacoeconomic analyses done in the real world, where you have effectiveness estimates, you have decreased adherence to some of these treatments, immunosuppressant treatments perhaps, and how does that impact some of the findings? And this was probably one of the ones that probably had a larger impact. But you're absolutely right. We had no idea how effectiveness of this transplant might change, or effectiveness of the immunosuppressant drugs, lower adherence. Patients having lesser follow-up and not being treated in a clinical trial setting. There could be considerable differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the risks when everybody wants to say, well, how is this going to translate into the real world? And we can estimate the costs, how it's going to change pretty well. But as far as the effectiveness, we don't necessarily have the tools or measurement abilities to really kind of translate how efficacy translates into effectiveness. So there's just inherent limitations in that, but to each their own.
All right, we have time for one more question if anyone has a question.
Hello, I'm Hillary. I'm the first year PhD student. So I have one question regarding the timing of conduct this study. So Bob, you mentioned probably in the very beginning of the slide, saying that FDA would approve the use of islet cell transplantation before FDA would with the evidence on the economic evaluation, we could get a treatment reimbursed before getting FDA approval. Can you tell them more about it?
Yeah, for sure. And welcome, Hillary. The FDA, what is it called? The recovery cost. Essentially, as when a manufacturer files for a new drug application or a new biologic application, they may have the opportunity to file for a cost recovery, which essentially allows the patients to access the medication to be able to reimburse. In this situation, it was kind of unique, and that's why their cost recovery application got approved, or maybe one of the reasons why it got approved is because the hospital is bearing a lot of the costs associated with this procedure, not necessarily the manufacturer, because the manufacturers cell trans, and essentially what they do is they go into the hospital and they isolate the cells, and they essentially use the hospital to do all these procedures. However, they don't have the capital to reimburse the hospital to do those types of things. So that's why that the FDA, since it was filed as an investigational drug and they were doing clinical studies, they were able to get approval for reimbursement for some of the costs that allowed, one, the manufacturer to be able to continue to conduct their research, and two, also so the patients could actually benefit from this. So it was kind of hand in hand where the FDA understood quite a bit about this research, and there's been 20 years of this procedure being conducted, that the FDA felt safe enough to be able to recover some of the costs that were going into the actual development and data generation for their filing for approval.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you, Bob. And thank you to all the attendees today. And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dan.
All right. Take care.